really delighted to introduce Eve Jacobs-Carnahan, an artist who creates knitted sculptures exploring themes of democracy and society. Her intricate work, often featuring birds and found objects, has been exhibited nationwide and earned regional and national recognition. A Creative Community Fellow, New England in 2021, Eve's art invites reflection through its unique blend of charm and storytelling. Please join me in welcoming Eve.
Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for having me. So first I want to just see whether people can hear me okay, because we could turn on, okay, all right. Okay. All right. This is such a great turnout. This is so great. People I know from all different ways, and even people I don't know.
And people from out of town.
And people from out of town. Wow, that's really great. So I'm going to ask who here knits or crochets. Raise your hand. Okay, but there's a couple people who don't. Are there people here who use textiles in some other way? Okay. And is there anybody here who makes art with political messages in some way? No, okay. So, okay.
I'm going to go like this
Yeah,
too.
all right, great. Okay.
Who didn't make a pink hat?
There you go. There you go. So, like many of you, my knitting experience started as a child. My mother taught me to knit, and I made mittens, vests, sweaters, all those things, all the way through high school and college and early adulthood. I followed patterns, I made classic garments, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I even heard about people using knitting in art. But when I heard about it, I was really taken. And the place I first heard about it was in a coffee table book called Knitting in America, and there was a profile of Catherine Colby, and this is actually a picture from that book. This was in the early 1990s, and she made this piece in honor of her mother, who had Alzheimer's, and it just moved me to tears because the shawl is misshapen and it drags on the floor and there are ragged edges and there are holes. Yet it's also the kind of thing that you would knit in a loving way for a family member, and it would be an embrace. And so just everything about the combination of it being knitting and storytelling and commentary just was fascinating to me. This is another piece of Catherine Colby's called Ritual Against Homelessness. And these look like people dancing on the shore, on the shore, but they are ragged blankets that she made. She hand spun the wool, she made these heavy blankets, natural colors, and they look dirty, as if they've been out on the street, and then those rough-hewn stakes that hold the arms, of course, they also look like crosses. So Catherine Colby was a poet before she was a knitter, and you can just see her use of metaphor and symbolism in everything she's doing. So I first learned about her in a book, and then I found out that she was giving a weekend retreat at the Green Mountain Spinnery in Putney, Vermont in the early aughts, and she was going to be talking about a garment construction technique that she invented called knitting on the diagonal, which I think she eventually wrote a book about. So I signed up for that, and I went for the weekend, and I had little kids at the time. I was like, I'm going, and she during the weekend, she did show some slides about her artwork. Nobody else was interested in that part of her work. They just wanted to know the how-to of making this diagonal technique, but not me. I sat next to her at dinner. I pumped her for information about using knitting in art. And then in 2003, I contacted her because she lived in Maine, and I said, could I come for a studio weekend session, just come visit and pick your brain? And she said yes. I did that twice. And so she was my first role model, and really she was a powerful woman, and she, if she had an eager student, she was going to push. And so that's kind of where things started for me. So I'm going to share a little bit about some other people who inspired me, other works. I'm going to show you some of my early works, and eventually I'm going to get to the public engagement, public art project that I'm doing that's about democracy. So this is another artist named Barb Hunt, and this piece is called Anti-Personnel, and these are explosive devices. These are hand grenades and other kinds of explosive devices. So of course, now that you know that, you're all sort of recoiling in shock, and that's what's so amazing about combining knitting with certain kinds of social messages is you sort of look at it, it's like, oh, that's sweet and pink, and like, oh, what are those? And she displayed these in a glass case because they're dangerous and you can't touch them. And they're just, they're very detailed, but just stomach turning when you start to think about what's going on. So I found that fascinating. This is Janet Morton in a performance piece where she is knitting a blanket that has headlines from the news that were happening at the time she was knitting this. She sat in that storefront window in Toronto for 10 to 5 every day, 6 days a week for a month. Wow. And she made this giant blanket. She set up the storefront window to look like it was a living room. She brought in this nice chair. She put these pictures on the walls, most of which have some reference to knitting. And she has like totally flipped the script and just totally changed what you're expecting, because she's knitting a newspaper, and she called this newsflash, but it is taking a long time. And this is 1995. You know, of course, now people don't even use newspapers, but and we think of newspapers as disposable. They're not kept, but you're going to keep this huge blanket that all this effort has gone into. She's doing it slowly and methodically, and she's doing this knitting in public. She has brought the private home world, the home sphere, into the public view because she's on the street, you know, in the storefront window. It's just a wonderful response to the chaos and speed of mass production and modern life. Another knitter artist who inspired me is Kat Maza, who she teaches at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, I think. She organized this project called the Nike Blanket Petition, and she organized people all around the world to knit and crochet these 4x4-inch squares to make a petition to protest unfair labor practices at Nike. And so it's made with handwork, and everybody signed it by having this little tag of their name on the piece. But it's a contrast to the factory work of the making of the Nike shoes and garments. So she raised awareness through the creation of the work, through touring it. I don't think she actually sent it as a petition because the people who worked on it said, don't send it to Nike, we want to keep it. And then she put it on display places with a documentary about some of the factory worker processes. And so this is another view to give you an idea of the size of it. And you can see the tags hanging off. And it's very imperfect because it has all these different pieces made in these different ways. So there's a theme in all of these works that it's all of these artists that I was attracted to were doing something that had to do with a social message. So I'm going to show you some of the works that I've made with a social message and take you kind of through how they've developed. So I brought this one today, Not Weed, Not Safe. It's from 2007, so it's one of my earlier works. And my subjects around that time were gardens and nature, very natural things for someone living in Vermont, of course. And in this particular work, I wanted to encourage people to notice invasive plants like Japanese knotweed so that they could identify them and then control them. It grows 8 to 10 feet tall, often along riverbanks. If you have any, you know it is super difficult to get rid of. It takes multiple years of digging, and often you have to use a pesticide on it. I mean, a herbicide. That hand in there, and you can see it in the real life one, has some red blood spots on it where the knotweed has just, stakes have just gone through the hand. And maybe that's the gardener's hand planting it in an ornamental garden, or maybe that's someone trying to rip it out. But I wanted to convey its danger, and I wanted to use these colors that were a little unsettling, these greens that weren't really happy with each other. But this piece is a happy piece, and it's here to also inspired by my garden, because I have some Rosa rugosa bushes in my garden. They actually are an invasive plant as well, but we've kind of come to accept them more than Japanese knotweed, perhaps. You often see them in parking lots because they will grow almost, they'll grow in very bad soils, and they will overcome, they bring these beautiful flowers, so they'll overcome trash and ugliness. So I use these cast-off materials that I found at a yard sale or some giveaway box to sort of contrast with the flowers coming out.
Did you knit the flowers?
Oh, yes. Oh, no, the flowers themselves are not knit. They are silk paper that I made the silk paper, Silk Fusion. But I didn't even say that all these things have knitting in them. I just assumed that you knew that. But yes, and so often sometimes I hand spun the yarns as well, so I could control their textures and colors. And I thought I'd just pause and say something about why I use yarn and knitting. And so one real simple reason is I didn't go to art school, but I learned to knit as a child, so it was a skill that I had that I was really comfortable with, and I could really do a lot with it. So I figured I'd stick with something that I knew. But also, it has these warm associations, and people are attracted to it because it's unusual or because it is knitting, and they're thinking like, oh, I like knitting. I have this scarf that somebody made. You know, it breaks down barriers and gets people to connect and to move in closer. And it also carries that touch of the hand of something, you know, truly personally created. So I began putting birds in with the plants as I got a little stronger, more comfortable with what I was doing, and I learned a lot about making armatures, the internal structures for sculptures. And my early pieces with birds were based on real birds. Like I got out my Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds and looked to see, okay, this wren, it has stripes and it has these color changes, and so I was trying to duplicate those. And this bird ended up in this piece called Encroachment, so that's the bird down there. And I used cast-off plumbing pieces that I put in there to represent real estate development that was coming in through this marshland, and that brown swath is a muddy tire track, and so it's supposed to look like the intrusion into this habitat. So when I work in my studio, I listen to the radio, I listen to podcasts, and one day I heard an interview with a journalist who was talking about the pollution in the Gulf of Mexico that came down the Mississippi River from the big agricultural operations way upstream. And the huge amount of nutrients that were put into the agricultural production would run off into the river and eventually end up in the Gulf, and they would feed the algae. So the algae, represented here by this gross, bubbly, green, felted, knitted algae, would choke out all the oxygen so that there couldn't be any fish. So that's why you have these, what they call a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So I was inspired to create this beautiful pelican eating, looking for food, but it can't find any food because there's this dead black water. And I used rubber, kind of an industrial product, to show the lack of food. And the beak is made from a tray that you would use to hold a corn on the cob at your table. So that also connects back to the agriculture. So this piece was in the library for the last couple of weeks, and it's here. And so this piece is one that I was using a plant, but I started to go in a new direction. So I made this piece in 2018, and looking back, I can see that as a little bit of a turning point in my work. So I'm moving a little bit away from nature and looking at social issues. So this piece was inspired by my research of my family's history of immigrating from Eastern Europe to the Minnesota Iron Range in 1907. They moved to this boom town where there was logging, and then there was the iron extraction, and it was settled by immigrants from all over Europe. And my great-grandfather was a butcher, and I actually because he went bankrupt, he had to file papers that had a list of all of his customers, who the debts were owed to or owed from. And so I could see all these names, and so I could see they're from all different cultures all around the world. And so that was really fascinating to me. And so I decided to create this with this bed of recipes from all these different cultures, but they're all cabbage recipes. And in my research, I learned that cabbage is really ubiquitous around the world. Different kinds of cabbage, of course, oriental cabbages and different kinds, but it's such a common vegetable that it's used in so many different ways. And it's also an inexpensive vegetable and plentiful, so it's something that people would make the most of wherever they could get it. And this is sort of a peek into some of the construction techniques I was using, and still use to some extent at that time, using wire to shape things, and then mulberry paper, strong paper, and gel medium to make the leaves, and then covering them with knitting. Okay, so until 2018, I was working as a lawyer in the Vermont Attorney General's office, and I was doing all of this artwork as in my spare time sort of thing. It was alongside it. I litigated cases in state and federal court. I advised legislative committees on issues of constitutional law. Most of my work around that time centered on election law, especially campaign finance reform. And I left the law office in 2018 and decided I would do art full time. So early in 2019, I went to the Leahy Center Environmental Summit, The Alchemy of Art and Science, held in Burlington. And there were artists and scientists, and they were talking about ways to use art to communicate science and to communicate concepts about the human impact on the environment, because I'd been making these pieces that had to do with the environment, so it made sense to do this. And the thing is, at that conference, I was realizing, I don't really know that much about the environment. There are all these really knowledgeable people here. And I didn't really think my artwork went deep enough into those issues. But then it sort of dawned on me, well, oh, I do know a lot about legal issues, and especially issues having to do with elections and campaign finance regulation. So the next piece I made was this one called At the Expense of Democracy. So it is an allegorical piece. The birds represent different characters in a societal drama. So the owl, whose wings are tipped with money, bits of money, is the campaign donor. And these strings coming down are coming down to this pigeon who has put bits of the money that he's received and put them in his nest. Pigeons nest on buildings, and they also, I learned, don't clean out their nests. They're sort of dirty. And they are in cities, so that seemed to make sense. And so I really was suggesting that that owl was controlling this pigeon. But of course, there's another kind of pigeon we often hear about, and those are the passenger pigeons, messenger pigeons, who will fly off and sound an alarm or a warning. And this pigeon with its beak open and its warning backpack is sounding an alarm. So that's the story that I put together for that piece. And I continued to think up stories and find ways to communicate concepts from the electoral world, but communicate them visually. So I'm sure many of you have seen this 1812 political cartoon that ran in a Boston newspaper after the Massachusetts governor Elbridge Gerry approved maps that drew crazy-shaped districts around Boston. And so the political cartoon, it had words all over. They were not as succinct in their captions in those days, but it said something about how the governor has created a new kind of monster, a Gerrymander, a salamander, and Elbridge Gerry. That's where that comes from. And that is the shape of this district that hooked around like that. So I thought, okay, salamanders, what could I do with that? So I made these clay salamanders about 9 inches long, decided that I would put the salamanders and a bird that eats them, green heron, into sort of a vignette, a collection of districts where there would be 3 creatures, 3 citizens in each district. In this district, there are 2 herons and 1 salamander who happens to be actually in the mouth of one of the herons at the moment. And I arranged these into 5 imaginary districts of swampy marshland. And I put real maps of real legislative congressional districts on the pedestals. So that's Ohio, and that duck-shaped district is indeed a real district. And it's seen in the sort of purple on the northwest of Ohio there. Here's one of the other birds in that collection. And this is not quite seeing all of them, but you see most of the birds. And so, like, here's another grouping of a district, the smaller, brighter colored boxes in the front. And then, so what happened is you've got 6 herons and 9 salamanders, and you divide them in 5 districts. By rights, just by sort of natural randomness, it should be that the salamanders should control more of those districts than the herons. But because you can gerrymander them by packing a whole bunch of salamanders, pack 3 salamanders in one district and 3 in another, and that way you leave the other 3 districts to be controlled by the herons. And even though the herons are vastly in the minority, they've got control 3-2 of the districts. So it was a way of showing that. Whether it really shows it without me standing there explaining it is another question, but that's the idea of what's going on here. So I started this theme because it was the election things were things that I knew about from my work. But then it turned out the world got more interested in things that were happening with elections. So after the 2020 election, many state legislatures around the country started to enact restrictive voting laws, voter suppression. One of the things they did was limit the hours that polls could be open, resulting in long lines. So that little sign says polls close 4 p.m., the clock shows that it's 10 to 4, and there is a long line of chicken voters waiting to get in to vote. This is from a series of 4 pieces that I made called Making the Voters Chicken. And so this one is line time. A lot of these, and so I used maps of, I can't remember what map that actually is, that it could very well be Pennsylvania, and that's definitely one of the states that has had issues. And these are laws that don't really have anything to do with election security or election integrity. Their real purpose is to make the voters afraid to go and vote, to make them chicken. This is another piece from that same series, and it's about voting by mail, and so there's all the forms flying around that the chicken has to manage. And this came to me because I volunteered on the Pennsylvania Voter Hotline in 2020, and so as you'll recall, that was early on in the pandemic, and it just so happened that in 2019, Pennsylvania enacted a wide open vote-by-mail law that let anybody vote by mail, but they didn't know that everybody was going to want to do it in 2020 because everybody was stuck at home or afraid to go to the polls. They didn't want to be with people. So on the hotline, we were fielding calls from frantic people who were saying, but I'm sick, or no, there's an outbreak in my community. I don't want to go to the polls. How do I get a ballot? Oh, I have to do that form. Where do I get that form? Okay, I've got the form now. Where do I return it? How do I return it? But there isn't, and then it's like, but I'm elderly and I don't drive. Can somebody else take it for me? No, not unless they've signed this other form. So, like, I wrote down some of the types of rules there. And in some states, not in Pennsylvania, you had to have your signature on the ballot notarized. In some, you had to enclose some kind of identification proof. Just so many rules. And it had to be done on time. And at that time, we were all thinking the post office wasn't reliable. So people were either mailing them or they had to figure out where they could take them to a place a Dropbox or another official place that would take them. So that's what was inspiring this piece. The 4th piece in this series is called Guarding the House. So I think you've all gotten the pun of the fox in the hen house, but this is a state house, and this fox is so nasty and big, despite its cute little eyes. It doesn't even fit in the state house. It's bursting outside. And I put out a note on Front Porch Forum saying, does anybody have any chicken feathers? And I got quite a few. So that's all that's left of those voter chickens in that pile of feathers. So this piece is called Lobby Disturbance, and I was making things a little less obvious, perhaps, as I was beginning to feel more comfortable in being able to communicate messages and maybe feeling that I didn't have to totally hit people over the head with my messages. So, but the story here is these are laughing gulls, and they are they're both campaign donors and lobbyists, and so that's the lobby reference, and they are at this elegant luncheon, but they've just tipped over the elegant food and broken the dishes, and there is money to be passed from one to another under a wing, under a teacup, in an envelope under there. And I dressed these gulls in fancy materials. The faces are made of silk fusion. The white parts of the body are linen napkins. The yarn I hand spun from a cashmere wool blend. So I made it, using fancy things that if you were fancy dressed in business attire, you might be wearing these things. So this piece is from my most recent series called Eternal Vigilance, and I forced myself to be even a little more general and allow more interpretation in this series of pieces. So for me, when I made this in the fall of 2023, I was thinking about creeping authoritarianism. But you can look at this piece and the ones I'll show you that follow, and they could be about other kinds of danger or confinement in your head, something to do with illness or other concepts of that kind. But what I'm doing here is playing with the idea of this beautiful enclosure. It has these outlines of birds on it, but actually it's a cage, and these birds that are in there are now in fear of the shadow of this hawk that's overhead, so they're huddled in there, and they thought they were safe, but maybe these beautiful shapes are like the ghosts of birds that didn't survive. Like, you could spin a lot of stories from this. And these birds are also sort of like proto-birds because they don't really have very functional wings, and they don't really have, they don't have any color. The fear has drained all the color out of them. So this is the sort of starting point of, okay, we didn't recognize the danger. Here you've got one of those same birds down in the bottom, and there's the cage. The beautiful, there's no more confusion that it is a dangerous cage. The cage now has words of danger around it. Power, terror, crush, words like that are spelled out in it. And this bird has burst through and broken part of the cage, has taken on some color, has wings that are sort of functional. They're sort of like paddles, but they're getting there. And it is, it's pushing out, and it's going to get out. The next piece in the series, the cage is broken. It's down on the ground. And these birds are getting ready to walk away. But they've got this swirling wire around them. And so maybe they're really not fully free in their heads yet, because it's a pretty big transition. And they do have nice birdiness, they're better shapes, but the fabrics, the knitting that I put on them has these kind of distressed, bumpy surfaces or the holes in them to show that there's still some troubles going on there. But now we've got a bird that's looking to the future. It's built a nest. It's caring for its nestlings. It's put aside its fears. You can see some of the pieces, some of the letters of those fears that have been put aside. There's one letter down there on the ground. There's some other letters hidden in here. And the letters that are in there spell out F-E-A-R-S, fears, or they could spell safer, same thing. So playing with that. And finally, we've got the bird that has finally flown free, and it's really got functioning wings, and they are all fiery orange and full of sunshine and energy and light. So this is the culmination of that series. So I want to go back to that environmental summit of art and alchemy in 2019. So that was the point where I said I started thinking about art that would build on themes that I knew something about, the democracy thing. But it was a really fascinating summit because the speakers made presentations about public art projects and installations and community engagement that they did with artwork around issues which all, in that event, all had to do with science, water, things like that. And I knew that there were some projects like that, like the Nike petition that I showed you back at the beginning. So at the conference, I had a conversation with Gauri Savour. Does anybody remember her from the Central Vermont? She was instrumental in making the paper lanterns that the Waterbury River of Light lanterns are about and did teaching in schools. Anyway, she told me about the Creative Community Fellows Fellowship program, and she said, because I said to her, how do I learn more about how I could do something like these people are doing? And she said, oh, there's this amazing fellowship. They'll give you all this training. And the application deadline is in 3 weeks. Like, okay. So I looked it up, and it turned out to apply, you had to tell them about a public art project you were already working on. So I said, well, what do I have to lose? So I thought up a public art project that I was already working on, and I called it Knit Democracy Together, and I put in this application, and I said, this is going to strengthen democracy through knitting circles. I'm going to, during the circles, I'll talk about the electoral process. People will come together to make a collaborative sculpture, and while they're knitting together and having this common bond of knitting, they'll be learning about the electoral process. So I did not get the fellowship. It was pretty obvious that I didn't have a well thought out program at that point. But I thought, well, I could do this project anyway. I'll try it out. And so that was 2019 when I made that application. And so by December 2019, I kind of had refined it, and I brought some people together, including, I think, a couple of people in this room, and and I said, let's try and see what this would be like. So anyway, I ended up starting this project in 2020, and I did get that fellowship when I applied a few years later, and it was a marvelous fellowship. So starting in 2020, I started holding knitting circles where people came who didn't know each other, but they had something in common, and I gave presentations about aspects of the electoral system. I started the project in March 2020, but it turned out I couldn't do it the way I intended. It had to be online and not in person, but that actually meant that I could do it anywhere. So I ended up during 2020 and 2021, I held sessions all around Vermont and in Chicago and in Rochester, New York, because I could do it remotely. And this is the Vermont version of the sculpture that we created. It's 5 feet long, 3.5 feet tall, 3 feet deep. And this was made from pieces created in the Vermont Knitting Circles in 2020 and 2021. And the symbolism here is that everybody was contributing something to the whole, the way you want in a community, the way you want in representative democracy. They all have a mark of the individuality, different colors, different textures of their makers, but they all come together to be something larger. And the hands that are on there are like members of the community who are still working to make the government work, to make the legislation work. They're holding yarn, they're knitting, there are bare spots. And so the project has continued to grow. There's Trudy right there. somebody knows Anne, who's here. And here we are at the Vermont State House with the Knitted State House. And these are pieces of the lawn and gardens which people made, and we had about 20 people come together at big long tables, and we sewed together the brown and green and flowered pieces of the lawn and gardens to put all around the State House sculpture, and it was on display there for about a month or more. And so then, in 2024, I took the project to New Hampshire, and I took as inspiration a piece of the Vermont sculpture to inspire people. And I did the project, I partnered with New Hampshire Humanities and held 12 knitting circles, half of them in schools, like with these middle schoolers, and the middle schoolers were making I-cord with little knitting spools, and half of them in the evenings with adults at libraries and cultural centers. And at the evening sessions, I gave presentations, for instance, this one about redistricting, which is also known as gerrymandering. And I could use, as an example, actual New Hampshire maps, because they had some recent experience. That map on the left with that claw-like shape coming down, that was the map proposed by the legislature. It changed the two U.S. congressional districts so drastically that it moved something like 95 towns into a different district in order to get that weird claw-like shape. And what they were trying to do was to make one district definitely safe for a Republican and one district, they said, okay, it could be a Democrat. Because New Hampshire is pretty evenly split. Well, the governor said that map was so extreme, Governor Sununu vetoed that map. And it ended up in the New Hampshire Supreme Court, where the court appointed a special master who drew this map, which only moved 1 or 2 towns from the previous maps. And so there's no more claw. There's no funny carve-outs. It's more like east side and west side. And both of those districts are competitive, so that either a Democrat or a Republican could win. So that's the completed New Hampshire State House with the window outlines made by the middle schoolers with the I-cord. And you're only seeing the front. This one, so I told you the Vermont one's long and narrow, 5 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. This is 5 feet by 5 feet footprint. It's really big. And kind of after that, I realized I should be more careful about sizes of things. It's really big, but I was so, I felt like I really accomplished something by bringing the sculpture, by bringing the project to a whole bunch of people in a short period of time in spring in New Hampshire, and to have this culminating event at the State Library in New Hampshire in this grand room. And we borrowed a traveling exhibit about the history of voting rights, borrowed from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American Art, and that's what's lining the sides here. And so people could come because maybe they had worked on it, or they heard about it, or they were in the library, and they could say, oh, this is cool, what is this crazy knitted thing? And oh, look at that. Women couldn't vote unless they were property owners at the time of the American Revolution, or, this, that, the other thing they could learn about here. So I thought that was I felt like I'd been able to pull things together. And the project is continuing. I just learned this week that we got a grant. Didn't get the full grant because there's some problems with the federal money, but we got a partial grant to take the sculpture on tour in New Hampshire back to the towns where people had worked on it, and we're going to have sort of open houses with a variety of speakers. I will just be one of the speakers, and we'll have different topics related to the electoral process, and that's going to happen this coming spring. Called the Granite State Democracy Tour. And so we'll use the sculpture again in that way.
Where is it, the sculpture?
It's
Where does
in
it
my
live?
spare bedroom. That's another reason not to make it so large.
How about the Vermont one? Where is that?
It's also there. When my kids come home, there's problems. And so I was,
Very warm though.
what? The
Very
very
warm though.
warm. So I was going to pause for questions before I show you my last slides.
Is there a list of the towns somewhere where that piece is going to be toured? I'm a New
Yes.
Hampshire resident.
That's right. We're not going to get all the way north. So there will shortly be one on my Knit Democracy Together website. And so I have business cards over there that have, on one side it has my art website, and the other side has the Knit Democracy website, so you can get it there. But we're going to go to 5 towns, and the furthest north is going to be Laconia and Hanover. But then
Oh, it's going to be Hanover.
Hanover, is that close to you? Okay, yeah. And then some of the southern New Hampshire towns as well. Yeah.
Did you have trouble getting the boys to take up knitting?
No, well, no. Partly because it was knitting spools, and partly because their teachers told them. But it was really interesting. So I did visit a Waldorf school. One of the schools was Waldorf school. I think they were 8th or 9th graders, and it happened to be all boys, and they all knew how to knit, and the teacher reminded them that they knew how. And then the others, they would, it was a tool, it was a cool tool, and some of them would say, I'm going to go home and tell people at home I was knitting, like they thought it was a cool thing. And they really got into it, and one teacher told me that some of her antsiest kids were focused during my presentation. Just what I've read about, that knitting calms your brain, and doing something repetitive, if it's not too hard, can help you focus. And this teacher knew from, I couldn't tell because I didn't know what the kids were usually like, but she commented to me that it really calmed them down. And she said, I'm going to dig out some knitting spools from our art supplies. I think we have some to do this.
And what age were those kids?
That particular class was either 6th or 7th grade. It was a little younger in the middle school range. Yeah.
I'm just having a thought, and I'm just hoping that some of those student knitters might now be in high school, involved in their student government, and maybe they could be one of the speakers at your events.
Oh, yeah.
And really, Tom.
Yeah. I don't know that we can actually accomplish that. So we were hoping to have the New Hampshire kid governor be one of our speakers, because that's a 5th grader who gets elected to be the governor. But it turns out the date we thought she could come, she has a dance recital or something like that, these active kids. But we are going to tell all of the schools that we're going to be in these places, and all the events are going to be on Saturday mornings. And so, yeah, that if we knew of one that was actually like that, that'd be cool. Yeah.
So I have another
No,
question.
that's good.
Do you think that this idea has potential, like New Hampshire? I mean, everybody's into politics there because, with the first primary state for all these years. But I wonder, in Vermont, we're pretty politically active. Is it going to work in Oklahoma, Missouri, or Indiana?
Yeah, so the my idea behind this is to have this comfortable place that you could come and learn something about the electoral process, but not feel threatened because you're just going to knit something. I have really tried to keep it nonpartisan, though unfortunately the people who are most partisan in the country right now will say anything that has to do with encouraging people to vote or making it easy to vote, they would consider it to be partisan. But I have really found that definitely people in New Hampshire were very knowledgeable about a lot of things about their systems, but they still weren't necessarily aware of how gerrymandering works, for instance, and how, one of the things I want people to understand is, like, why should we care if there's gerrymandering in North Carolina? Well, we should care because it affects Congress, and that affects what Congress can accomplish. And one of the other things I talk about are the alternatives to the winner-take-all primary system, ranked choice voting. So we don't have much of that. I mean, Burlington does have it, and Maine, but New Hampshire doesn't, for instance, so that was a topic they weren't familiar with. So I have been, I am going to Boston in April to hold some sessions with the Boston Public Library, and I'm exploring, I'm trying to make connections with some other people to hold sessions in other places in New England. And I'm exploring the possibility of training people to hold sessions elsewhere. It's really, throughout this whole process, I've learned as much about organizing events and projects as I have about knitting. And what does it mean to work with partners and to promote things and market things and make them work effectively. And so far, I've been working on places I can drive to. If I have to go somewhere further away, it becomes so much more complicated. So this is a much longer answer than you wanted, but I am trying to figure out how I might be able to train some people to do the project in other places. But it's so much of my topics also changed and responded as events and news and new conspiracy theories came out. Yeah.
Did the students, were they invited to respond and assess their experience?
We asked the teachers so New Hampshire Humanities had some evaluation forms that they sent to the teachers, and it was up to the teachers to do some kind of assessment within their classrooms. You're talking about educational assessment that way?
Well, I thought it would be wonderful for them to be able to weave their responses into their experience so that you would have information from them and they would be creating an opportunity where they took all of this experience and then took it to a whole new level, which is, here's what I was thinking, and journal, or not even journal, but some that you could get information that they would be invited to give information, and maybe it would be in a woven tapestry way.
Yeah, we didn't do that level of feedback. We did with the students. It was up to the teachers to do that within their classrooms. But we did actually, with the adults, we had storytelling cards. We asked them to write we had a couple of prompts and asked the adults to write something like what was some memorable voting experience or something like that. And we displayed those stories at the New Hampshire State Library with the finished sculpture. Yeah, that'd be a great idea. But I was in the classrooms for 2 hours, just for one little session. It wasn't an ongoing thing. But that would be the next iteration. So here is a picture of me at that reception at the New Hampshire State Library. And I just wanted to point out one other piece of symbolism. So the dome, there's the dome, the tower and the dome in New Hampshire. And we put a cake of yarn, small cake up there. And you may notice that there's a loose strand coming off of it. And I attached a needle to that strand and put it there. And what I urged people to do was to pick up that loose thread to repair democracy. Because that's what I'm trying to do with the Public Art Project, is to help people understand the electoral process more so that they can find ways to improve it and protect it and keep it working. So here are some of my upcoming events, which are also on my website. But so some of my newer work, probably not any of these, but some of my newer work is going to be on display at the gallery on the second floor of the Adamant Co-op, which I didn't even know existed until recently, but it's open when the co-op is open. It's very informal, but there's going to be about 6 fiber artists who are going to be showing work there. So I'm going to have half a dozen works there from mid-March to mid-April. And then so the first stop on the Granite State Democracy Tour is going to be in Keene, New Hampshire, March 29th. And then I'm doing these events in Boston. But you can get details about those at knitdemocracy.org or for the artwork at evejacobs-carnahan.com. And I do have a little sign there if you want to get on either one of my email lists or both. But one is for the artwork events and talks and exhibits, and I share once a month like some story from my studio. I might show you work in progress or something like that, or some art that's inspired me. And then the other newsletter talks about the Knit Democracy Together events, but also has reflections once a month on something that's going on in the news. So it's a little more of the political insights from a lawyer. And I also wanted to say, just a shout out, that there's a bunch of people here from the Green Mountain Knitting Guild, and Judy here is one of the coordinators. And so if anybody is like a little bit of a knitter, wants to be more of a knitter, wants to knit with other people online and learn things, just talk to Judy and find out how to get on that list. Because I have learned a lot from being in that group. So thank you.
I also, before everyone leaves, wanted to invite everyone we're doing a fiber night at the library. So on Wednesday, March 6th from 5:30 to 7, if anybody wants to come and knit in front of the fire with a cup of tea, please join us.
You actually build a fire?
No, there's just a fireplace. And I try to make it look cozy because we're not allowed to do that. March 6th from 5:30 to 7. It'll be in the newsletter and on our website and stuff like that, but since I had a whole bunch of knitters together, or fiber artists,
You got it.
I was like, I gotta tell everybody now, so. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.